The device registered light where there should have been only darkness, a spectrum no human eye was designed to perceive, flooding the sealed room with radiance that left burn patterns on metal and shadows scorched into concrete. The scientist did not look away. And when the light finally collapsed inward, pulling the air itself towards something no longer there, every instrument in the laboratory went silent except for one, a machine designed to measure absence, which screamed with readings that translated into a single impossible word, repeated across every monitor, every screen, every flickering display, until the power failed entirely. Before we begin, we would like to know where you are listening to this story from and what time it is. The laboratory existed in a place where science was supposed to answer questions, not create them. Situated beneath the neuroscience wing of a research hospital in upstate New York, the facility had been constructed in the early 1990s with funding from agencies that preferred not to be named in published papers. The walls were reinforced concrete. The ventilation system operated independently from the main building, and every piece of equipment inside had been calibrated to detect phenomena that most scientists refused to acknowledge might exist. It was here, in the winter of 2017, that Dr. Jonathan Mercer began an experiment that would end his career, fracture his understanding of reality, and leave physical evidence that contradicted every principle of physics he had spent 30 years studying. Mercer was not a man prone to mysticism or supernatural belief. His doctoral thesis had focused on the electromagnetic properties of neural tissue during the transition from life to death, a subject that occupied the uncomfortable boundary between medicine and philosophy. He had published 17 papers in peer-reviewed journals, served on 3 institutional review boards, and maintained a reputation for methodological rigor that bordered on obsessive. His colleagues described him as cautious, thorough, and deeply skeptical of any claim that could not be replicated under controlled conditions. This made what happened in the final weeks of his work all the more disturbing, because Jonathan Mercer was the last person who would fabricate evidence or misinterpret data, and yet the recordings from his laboratory suggested he had witnessed something that should not exist. The experiment itself was designed to measure electrical activity in the human brain during the moments immediately following cardiac arrest. Mercer had obtained approval from the Hospital Ethics Committee to monitor patients who had elected to withdraw life support, individuals with irreversible neurological damage, whose families had made the decision to allow natural death. The setup involved a dense array of electroencephalogram sensors, 16 high-sensitivity electromagnetic field detectors, 3 infrared cameras, and a device Mercer had built himself, a modified spectrometer capable of detecting light emissions across wavelengths far beyond the visible spectrum. The entire system fed into a central recording unit that logged data at a rate of 10,000 samples per second, creating a continuous record of every measurable phenomenon in the room. For the first 8 monitored cases, the results were exactly what existing literature predicted. Brain activity decreased in a characteristic pattern, large, slow waves appearing as oxygen deprivation progressed, followed by a brief surge of high-frequency oscillations that neuroscientists had termed the wave of death, a final electrical cascade that swept across the cortex before all organized activity ceased. The electromagnetic detectors registered minor fluctuations consistent with the dissipating electrical fields of dying neurons. The infrared cameras showed gradual cooling of tissue. Nothing unusual occurred, nothing that challenged established understanding, and Mercer prepared to publish his findings as confirmation of existing models. The 9th case was different from the beginning. The patient was a woman in her late 60s. Terminal diagnosis, family present during the withdrawal of support. Mercer had set up the equipment in the usual configuration, Sensors placed across the scalp, electromagnetic detectors positioned at precise intervals around the bed, cameras recording from 3 angles. The spectrometer was running its baseline calibration, measuring the ambient light spectrum of the room, which consisted primarily of fluorescent overhead fixtures and the various indicator lights on medical equipment. Everything appeared normal. The attending physician removed the ventilator tube, administered comfort medications, and stepped back to allow the natural process to unfold. For the first 9 minutes, the patient's decline followed the expected trajectory. Respiration became irregular, heart rate decreased, oxygen saturation dropped below measurable levels. The electroencephalogram showed the characteristic slowing pattern, brain waves lengthening and decreasing in amplitude as consciousness faded. Mercer watched the monitors, noting timestamps, prepared for the final surge that would precede complete silence. The electromagnetic detectors hummed quietly, registering nothing beyond normal background levels. The infrared cameras displayed the gradual thermal signature of a body beginning to cool. At exactly 9 minutes and 43 seconds after ventilator withdrawal, something changed. The spectrometer alarm sounded first, a high-pitched tone that indicated the device had detected light outside its programmed parameters. Mercer glanced at the display and felt his certainty fracture. The spectrometer was registering ultraviolet emissions, wavelengths in the range of 200 to 300 nanometers, frequencies associated with deep UV that should not be present in a hospital room with standard lighting. The intensity was climbing, the graph on the screen rising steadily, numbers increasing beyond anything the ambient environment could produce. Mercer checked the sensor, thinking it had malfunctioned. But the calibration indicators showed green, all systems functioning within normal range. The electromagnetic detectors began registering anomalies at 9 minutes and 51 seconds. The devices measured fields in the extremely low frequency range, 1 to 30 Hz, the territory of neural oscillations and power line interference. But the readings now appearing were different. Organized patterns rather than random noise, repeating structures that suggested coherent generation rather than background fluctuation. The amplitude was wrong, too strong to be produced by biological tissue, increasing in a way that made no physical sense. Mercer stood from his chair, watching the numbers climb, listening to the detectors produce a rising electrical whine as their circuits struggled to process input beyond their designed range. The electroencephalogram went offline at 9 minutes and 56 seconds. Not gradually, not with a characteristic flatline, but instantly, all channels simultaneously dropping to 0 as if the sensors had been disconnected. Mercer knew they had not been disconnected. He could see the leads still attached, but the machine showed no signal, no artifact, no indication that it was receiving any data. He moved toward the patient, thinking there had been a cable failure, reaching to check connections. And that was when he saw the light. It began as a faint luminescence beneath the skin, visible first at the center of the chest, directly over the sternum. The glow was pale blue-white, reminiscent of certain forms of bioluminescence but far brighter, bright enough to be clearly visible under the overhead fluorescence. Mercer stopped moving, his hand suspended above the patient's shoulder, watching as the light spread outward, tracing along what appeared to be pathways, networks that followed no anatomical structure he recognized. The illumination moved up toward the throat, down into the abdomen, radiating along the arms toward the hands. It was not a reflection, not an artifact of the room's lighting. It was coming from within the body itself, passing through tissue as if flesh were translucent. The family members saw it too. Mercer heard the daughter gasp, heard someone say something about angels or heaven, but he was not thinking in religious terms. He was trying to catalogue what he was witnessing in language that made scientific sense. Subcutaneous photon emission, he thought. possibly related to residual neural activity, some unknown biochemical process releasing stored energy in the form of light. Except the intensity was wrong, and the spectrum was wrong, and the pattern of spread suggested organization that required active control, not random decay. The light grew brighter. It concentrated in the chest region, pulsing now in a rhythm that did not match the ceased heartbeat. A slower cadence, something measured and deliberate. The spectrometer alarm became a continuous scream. Mercer looked at the display and saw readings that made him question whether the device was broken or whether he was witnessing something that violated known physics. The ultraviolet emissions had intensified to levels that should have been causing tissue damage, wavelengths energetic enough to break chemical bonds, yet the skin showed no signs of burning. More disturbingly, the spectrum had expanded into ranges the spectrometer should not be able to detect, frequencies reaching into the extreme ultraviolet and beyond, territories that existed only in stellar coronas and laboratory plasma experiments. At 10 minutes and 12 seconds, the light burst. There was no other word for it, no gentler description. The luminescence that had been building within the patient's body suddenly erupted outward, filling the room with radiance so intense that Mercer's vision whited out completely. He heard the electromagnetic detectors overload, circuits popping as they failed, heard the crash of equipment tipping, heard someone screaming, though he could not tell if it was one of the family members or himself. The light was not just bright, it carried force. A pressure wave that pushed against him made him stagger backward, left his skin feeling sunburned and his eyes streaming with tears. The temperature in the room spiked. He felt it like standing too close to an open furnace, a wave of heat that should not be possible from a single human body. The event lasted approximately 4 seconds. When Mercer's vision cleared, the light was gone. The patient lay motionless on the bed, appearing exactly as she had before, skin pale, features composed, showing no signs of the extraordinary emission that had just occurred. The electroencephalogram had reactivated, displaying a flat line, the expected result after cessation of brain activity. The electromagnetic detectors were silent, half of them displaying error messages, their sensors burned out. The spectrometer screen was dark, the device completely non-functional, thin trails of smoke rising from its ventilation ports. The room smelled of ozone and something else, something acrid and metallic that Mercer could not identify. The walls showed discoloration, patches of darker concrete as if exposed to intense heat. The metal frame of the patient's bed had developed a strange patina, a rainbow sheen like oil on water, though nothing had been spilled. The vinyl floor tiles near the bedside had warped, bubbling slightly as if heated beyond their tolerance threshold. Most disturbing were the shadows, dark marks scorched into the concrete wall opposite the bed, patterns that resembled human figures with arms raised, shapes burned into the surface by light that had come from the wrong direction, creating shadows where there should have been illumination. Mercer stood in the center of the devastation, trying to process what had occurred, trying to fit the observations into a framework that did not require abandoning everything he understood about physics and biology. Heat bloom from rapid chemical breakdown, he thought, possibly a cascade reaction in dying tissue releasing stored energy. But the timescale was wrong, and the spectrum was wrong, and no chemical process he knew could produce that intensity of light while leaving the surrounding tissue unmarked. The patient's skin showed no burns, no blistering, no indication that it had been the source of thermal radiation capable of damaging concrete and metal. The family left quickly, disturbed but interpreting the event through a religious lens, speaking of the soul's departure, of heaven opening, of proof that death was not the end. Mercer did not argue with them, did not try to offer scientific alternatives because he had none that sounded convincing even to himself. He waited until they had gone, then began documenting the physical evidence. photographing the discolored walls, the warped floor, the burned-out equipment. He collected data files from the surviving instruments, downloading logs that would take weeks to fully analyze. He wrote notes in a careful hand, describing observations without interpretation, facts without conclusions. The hospital administration was not pleased. The damaged equipment represented significant financial loss, and there were questions about whether Mercer's experimental setup had caused some kind of electrical malfunction that endangered the patient and family. He explained that the power surge had originated from an unknown source, possibly related to physiological processes during death, but he could see the skepticism in their faces, the unspoken assumption that he had made an error, perhaps used faulty equipment or failed to properly ground his instruments. They placed his research on temporary suspension pending an investigation. Mercer did not protest. He needed time to examine the data, to understand what he had witnessed before attempting to explain it to anyone else. The recordings were worse than he had hoped and more conclusive than he had feared. The infrared cameras had captured the light burst. Though their sensors had been overwhelmed, the footage overexposed to the point of uselessness for those critical 4 seconds. But the moments before were clear, showing the luminescence spreading through the body, the way it moved with apparent purpose rather than random diffusion. Mercer watched the playback repeatedly, frame by frame, trying to identify anatomical correlates, trying to map the light pathways to known structures, blood vessels or nerves or lymphatic channels. Nothing matched. The illumination followed routes that did not correspond to any system catalogued in medical literature. The electromagnetic data was fragmentary, half the detectors having failed. But the surviving logs showed something that made Mercer's hands shake as he reviewed the files. The fields recorded in the seconds before the burst were not random, they were structured, organized into patterns that repeated with mathematical precision. He ran the data through frequency analysis software, expecting to find harmonic relationships or resonances that might suggest some natural oscillation. Instead, he found something that looked like information, like modulation, like a signal being transmitted or generated according to rules that implied intention. He brought the data to a colleague in the physics department, a woman who specialized in electromagnetic phenomena and owed him a favor from years prior. She examined the waveforms, ran her own analyses, and finally looked at him with an expression he had never seen her wear, something between fascination and unease. She told him the patterns were reminiscent of coherent radiation, of lasers or masers, systems that required precise conditions and active control to produce. She asked where the data had come from. Mercer told her it was from a medical monitoring setup during end-of-life care. She asked if there had been any electronic medical equipment active in the room. He confirmed there had been. She suggested, carefully, that perhaps the signal was some kind of interference or artifact from those devices. But Mercer knew that was not the answer, because he had baseline recordings from the other 8 cases. Recordings made with the same equipment in the same room with similar medical devices active, and none of them showed anything like what appeared in the 9th case. Something had generated those fields, something within or associated with the dying patient, and it had done so in a manner that suggested organization far beyond anything random chemical processes could produce. He returned to the laboratory after hours, when the neuroscience wing was empty and no one would question his presence. The room had been cleaned, the damaged equipment removed, the burned sections of wall painted over as if erasing the evidence would erase the questions. But the shadows were still visible if he looked closely, faint outlines beneath the fresh paint, figures with arms raised toward something that was no longer there. Mercer stood in the space where the bed had been, where the patient had lain during those final moments, and tried to imagine what had actually occurred. A release, he thought, energy stored in neural tissue and liberated at the moment of death. But stored where and in what form, and by what mechanism could biological systems contain and then emit radiation in the extreme ultraviolet spectrum with intensities sufficient to damage construction materials? He thought about consciousness, about the electrical nature of thought, about theories that treated the brain as a kind of quantum computer where coherence might be maintained in microtubules or other cellular structures. If consciousness were somehow electromagnetic in nature, could its dissolution produce a burst of organized energy? Could the collapse of that organization result in the kind of emission he had witnessed? It sounded like mysticism, like the kind of pseudoscientific speculation that ended careers, and yet he could not dismiss it, because the physical evidence was real, the recordings were real, the burned equipment and scorched walls were real. Mercer submitted a request to continue his monitoring program, framing it as investigation into unusual electromagnetic phenomena during the dying process, avoiding any language that might sound supernatural or unscientific. The Ethics Committee was reluctant, but eventually approved a continuation under stricter oversight, with additional safety measures and independent observers present during any future monitoring sessions. He rebuilt his equipment array, replacing the destroyed detectors and spectrometer, adding additional instruments that could measure across even broader frequency ranges. He installed surge protectors and isolation circuits, trying to prevent another cascading failure if the phenomenon repeated. It took 3 months before another suitable case arose, another patient electing to withdraw support, another family consenting to allow monitoring during the process. Mercer set up his equipment with meticulous care, checking every connection twice, confirming that all instruments were functioning within expected parameters. An observer from the hospital's Research Integrity Office attended, present to ensure protocols were followed, skeptical but professional. The family gathered around the bedside, holding the patient's hands, speaking in soft voices about love and memory and the hope of peace. The process began at 2 in the afternoon, ventilator withdrawn, medications administered, monitors tracking the gradual decline. Mercer watched his instruments, waiting for anomalies, prepared for repetition of the phenomenon he had documented months earlier. The first 15 minutes proceeded without incident. Brain activity following the predicted pattern of degradation, electromagnetic readings stable, spectrometer showing only ambient room light. The patient's breathing slowed, became irregular, finally ceased. The heart continued beating for another 30 seconds, then stopped, the electrocardiogram tracing a final depolarization before going flat. Nothing unusual occurred. Mercer felt simultaneous relief and disappointment. Relief that the family was not subjected to a terrifying and inexplicable event. Disappointment that he had not obtained additional evidence that might help explain what had happened in that first case. Perhaps it had been an anomaly, a unique circumstance never to be repeated, a confluence of factors that existed only once and could not be reproduced. The observer made notes on his tablet, clearly satisfied that the monitoring had proceeded without drama. The family said their goodbyes and left. Medical staff entered to begin post-death procedures. 3 hours later, Mercer was reviewing the data files when he noticed something in the electromagnetic logs, a brief fluctuation that had occurred approximately 5 minutes after the heart stopped, well into the period when all biological activity should have ceased. It was subtle, barely above background noise, a small, organized pulse that lasted less than half a second. He might have dismissed it as artifact, except that it appeared on multiple detectors simultaneously. The signature, too, coordinated to be random interference. He checked the corresponding timestamp on the infrared camera recording. The image showed the patient lying motionless, medical personnel having not yet entered the room, nothing visibly occurring. But when he adjusted the playback settings, enhancing the thermal sensitivity, he saw something. A brief area of increased temperature at the center of the chest, a hotspot that appeared suddenly, glowed for a fraction of a second, then dissipated. The temperature increase was minor, only a few degrees, far less dramatic than the intense burst from the first case, but unmistakably present, unmistakably coordinated with the electromagnetic anomaly. He reviewed recordings from the other 8 cases, searching for similar signatures. 2 showed minor fluctuations that could be interpreted as matching the pattern, small electromagnetic pulses occurring minutes after cardiac arrest, faint thermal variations in regions near the center of the body. He had missed them in his initial analyses because they were so subtle, so brief, easily attributable to equipment noise or lingering metabolic activity. But now, looking specifically for the signature, he could see the pattern, the suggestion that something occurred during the minutes after death, something small and organized that existed at the boundary of measurement. Except in one case, it had not been small, it had been overwhelming. A release of energy so intense it destroyed equipment and left physical marks on the environment. Why the difference? What had been unique about that 9th patient, that particular death, that specific moment? Mercer began investigating the medical histories, looking for commonalities or differences that might explain the variance in observed phenomena. The patient who had produced the dramatic light burst had suffered a stroke 3 years prior, leaving her in a persistent vegetative state with minimal cortical activity but intact brainstem function. The other patients had varied diagnoses: end-stage cancers, heart failure, respiratory disease, but none with significant neurological impairment. Was the difference related to brain injury? Did the breakdown of cortical tissue somehow prime the system for a more dramatic energy release? Or was it simply chance, random variation in a process that occurred in every death but manifested with different intensities? He found himself reading literature far outside his usual domain, papers on near-death experiences, accounts of deathbed visions, historical descriptions of light phenomena associated with dying. The reports were anecdotal, uncontrolled, scientifically questionable, but they described events that sounded disturbingly similar to what he had witnessed. People spoke of seeing brilliant light, of feeling heat, of watching something leave the body of the dying person, something luminous and ethereal that rose upward before vanishing. Mercer had always dismissed such accounts as hallucinations or misperceptions, the brain's response to grief and trauma creating illusions of meaning in random sensory noise. But now he wondered if those witnesses had been seeing something real, something measurable, something that existed at the intersection of physics and the ending of consciousness. The scientific community did not react well to his preliminary findings. He presented a paper at a neuroscience conference, carefully worded, focusing on the electromagnetic anomalies and thermal signatures without speculating about their source or meaning. The reception was hostile, questions implying that his methodology was flawed, that he had not properly controlled for interference, that the dramatic case was likely equipment malfunction rather than genuine phenomenon. One prominent researcher openly suggested that Mercer was either incompetent or fabricating data to generate attention. He defended his work calmly, presenting calibration records and redundant measurements, but he could see the skepticism hardening into dismissal, the community's refusal to engage with observations that challenged fundamental assumptions. He submitted a full paper to 3 peer-reviewed journals. All rejected it, citing concerns about reproducibility, inadequate controls, and conclusions that were not supported by the data. One reviewer wrote that while the observations were interesting, they required extraordinary evidence to justify extraordinary claims, and the current data set did not meet that threshold. Another suggested that Mercer had become too invested in finding something anomalous and was now interpreting normal variation as significant signal. The research funding was not renewed. The hospital administration, concerned about reputation and tired of fielding questions about the unorthodox monitoring program, quietly terminated Mercer's laboratory access. His colleagues began avoiding him, conversations in hallways becoming awkward and brief, invitations to collaborate mysteriously vanishing. He understood what was happening. He was being isolated, pushed toward the margins, treated as someone who had lost scientific rigor and could no longer be trusted. But he could not abandon the work because he had seen something real, measured something genuine, and the fact that others refused to accept it did not change the truth of the observations. He continued analyzing the data from his home computer, refining his models, looking for patterns that might make the phenomenon predictable or controllable. He built a smaller version of the electromagnetic detection array using commercial sensors and amateur radio equipment, portable enough to be transported in a backpack. If he could not continue official research, he would conduct unofficial investigations, monitoring deaths wherever he could gain access. He began attending hospice facilities, volunteering as a companion for patients in their final hours, bringing his concealed equipment, recording data without informing staff or families. The ethics were questionable at best, potentially criminal depending on interpretation of consent laws, but Mercer justified it to himself as necessary. The pursuit of knowledge that could not be obtained through conventional channels. Over the course of a year, he monitored 43 deaths, collecting data on electromagnetic fluctuations, thermal variations, atmospheric changes. Most showed the subtle signature he had identified, the brief organized pulse occurring minutes after cardiac arrest, small enough to be easily missed but unmistakably present in the aggregate data. 3 showed larger emissions, not as dramatic as the original case, but significant, producing measurable temperature increases and electromagnetic fields strong enough to affect nearby electronic devices. One caused a cell phone to spontaneously reboot, the screen flickering with distortion before recovering. Another triggered a cardiac monitor in an adjacent room to display erratic readings for several seconds, despite being connected to a living patient with stable vitals. The third caused the lights in the hospice room to flicker and dim, not a power outage, but a voltage drop localized to that single circuit, as if something were drawing energy from the electrical system. Mercer documented everything, building a database of observations that he knew would never be published, never be accepted, never change the scientific consensus. But it was real. It was reproducible within the constraints of studying an inherently unpredictable event, and he could not unsee what he had seen, could not pretend that death was merely the cessation of metabolism and the decay of structure. One evening in late autumn, he was present at the death of a man in his 80s, retired physicist, someone who had spent his career studying quantum mechanics and field theory. They had spoken during the man's final days, conversations about science and mystery, about the boundaries between known and unknown. The physicist had been intrigued by Mercer's work, untroubled by its controversial nature, commenting that anyone who studied quantum mechanics for long enough learned to be comfortable with phenomena that defied intuitive understanding. As the man's breathing slowed toward its final rhythm, he opened his eyes, looked directly at Mercer, and spoke in a clear voice despite the proximity to death. He said something about light, about how the equations had always suggested that consciousness might be electromagnetic coherence, patterns held in fields rather than tissue, and if that were true, then the dissolution of those patterns should produce detectable signatures, energy liberated from structure, information released from its physical substrate. He said that perhaps what Mercer was measuring was not supernatural, but simply natural, in a way that current physics did not yet describe. phenomenon that existed in the space between what was known and what was possible. The man closed his eyes and died quietly 3 minutes later. The electromagnetic detectors registered a strong signature, well above baseline, a pulse that lasted 2.3 seconds and showed clear organization in its frequency structure. The temperature in the room increased by 4 degrees Celsius over a period of 10 seconds, then returned to ambient. The overhead light fixture made a soft popping sound, and one of the fluorescent tubes went dark. Filament burned out by a voltage surge that should not have occurred. Mercer sat in the dim room, looking at his equipment displays, reading the numbers that confirmed once again what he had measured so many times, and felt something shift in his understanding. Not evidence of an afterlife, not proof of a soul, but indication that the process of death involved energy transformations that current biology did not account for, releases of something that had been contained during life and became free at its ending. What happened to that energy after release? Where it went, whether it retained any organization or simply dissipated into random heat and electromagnetic noise? Those were questions his instruments could not answer. He left the hospice and drove through darkness toward the city, empty roads reflecting yellow streetlight. The world appearing exactly as it had before he had begun this research, unchanged by what he had learned. But his perception was different now, his sense of reality altered by the knowledge that every death released something measurable, something that escaped instruments not designed to detect it, something that existed for brief moments at frequencies and intensities that bordered on the impossible. The data files remained on his computer, hundreds of recordings, thousands of measurements, a comprehensive documentation of phenomenon that had no official explanation and no accepted theoretical framework. He had stopped trying to publish, stopped attempting to convince his peers, accepted that this work would remain his alone until some future generation of scientists developed tools sensitive enough and minds open enough to investigate what he had found. Sometimes he wondered if he had made an error, if years of recording and analysis had convinced him of patterns that were only noise, signal that was only statistical fluctuation dressed up as meaning. But then he would remember that first case, the burst of light that had been bright enough to leave physical marks, hot enough to warp metal and concrete, real enough to be witnessed by multiple people and documented by multiple independent instruments. That had not been noise, that had not been error, that had been something genuine and inexplicable. And if it could happen once, then the smaller signatures he measured in every other case were likely real as well, smaller expressions of the same underlying process. He continued monitoring deaths, continued collecting data, continued building a record that he knew would probably be destroyed or lost after his own death, dismissed as the obsessive work of someone who had abandoned scientific rigor in pursuit of phantom phenomenon. But he could not stop, because he had seen the light, measured the fields, felt the heat of something leaving, and he knew with absolute certainty that death was not simply the end of function, but the release of something that had been bound, a transformation that occurred at the boundary between existence and absence, a process that modern science had no framework to comprehend. The laboratory where it had all begun was now used for different research, the equipment replaced, the walls repaired, the shadows painted over so thoroughly that no trace remained of that afternoon when light had burst from a dying body and rewritten everything Jonathan Mercer believed about the nature of human consciousness. But sometimes at night, he would return to the building, stand in the hallway outside that room, and remember the moment when his understanding had shattered, when the instruments had screamed with impossible readings, when the world had revealed itself to be stranger and more mysterious than any textbook acknowledged. The recordings existed, preserved on hard drives in a safe deposit box, time-stamped and checksummed, proof against accusations of alteration or fabrication. The measurements were real, the phenomenon was real, and someday Perhaps decades or centuries from now, someone else would detect the same signatures and begin asking the same questions. And perhaps by then, the scientific community would be ready to accept that death released something measurable, something organized, something that looked remarkably like light burst from divine source, though it was likely nothing more than energy escaping structure. Pattern dissolving into chaos, the electromagnetic signature of consciousness unbinding from the neural tissue that had contained it. Until that time, Jonathan Mercer would continue his work in shadow and silence, documenting the impossible, measuring what should not exist, collecting evidence that contradicted every established principle, while refusing to explain itself in terms that current physics could accommodate. He had seen the light, and having seen it, he could not unsee, could not forget, could not return to the comfortable certainty that death was merely biological cessation. Something happened in those final moments, something that instruments detected and witnesses perceived, something that left burn marks on concrete and shadows on walls and questions that had no answers, only observations that repeated themselves with disturbing consistency across dozens of cases, a pattern that suggested death was not ending but transformation, not cessation but release, not darkness but light bursting from sources that science insisted should contain no luminance, no heat, no organized radiation, only cooling tissue and failing cells, and the slow dissolution of structure into entropy. The measurements said otherwise. The recordings contradicted that comfortable narrative, and somewhere in the gap between what was observed and what was believed, in the space between documented evidence and accepted theory, existed a truth that Jonathan Mercer had devoted his remaining years to cataloguing, a phenomenon that refused to be explained, only witnessed, only measured, only experienced by those who stood close enough to death to see what emerged in those final moments, when the boundary between life and absence became thin enough to allow something through, something that registered on instruments as light and heat and electromagnetic organization, but felt, to those who witnessed it, like something far more profound, something that looked remarkably like proof that human consciousness was not merely neural electricity, but rather something held temporarily in flesh, something that escaped when the holding failed, something that burst forth in those last seconds with enough force to leave physical evidence of its passage. Marks that persisted after the body had been removed and the room cleaned and the incident officially forgotten. Shadows burned into concrete by light from the wrong direction. Shapes that suggested figures with arms raised, reaching toward something that instruments could detect, but understanding could not grasp. Phenomenon at the edge of measurement and the boundary of explanation. Real but incomprehensible. Documented but inexplicable, witnessed but impossible, light where there should have been only darkness, heat where there should have been only cold, presence departing from absence, signal emerging from noise, organization escaping from dissolution, and always in every case that same suggestion that death released something, liberated something, allowed something to escape that had been contained during life, something that science measured but could not name, something that looked divine, but might merely be natural in ways that current understanding could not accommodate. Light bursting from dying flesh, divine or otherwise, unexplained and probably unexplainable, at least until someone developed instruments sensitive enough or theories comprehensive enough to bridge the gap between observation and comprehension, between documented fact and accepted knowledge, between what Jonathan Mercer had witnessed and what the scientific community was willing to believe.